It began with a whisper of sickness in the East, and within a few years, half of Europe was gone. But what if the real story of the Black Death isn't what you were told? It began quietly. A strange fever in a distant town, a handful of merchants who never made it back from the East, and then silence. But that silence would not last. By the summer of 1347, whisper spread faster than the wind. Ships arrived from the Black Sea carrying something no one could see, no one could fight. Within weeks, ports that once rang with the sound of trade were filled with screams and bells, tolling endlessly for the dead. Cities shut their gates, families sealed their homes, afraid to even bury their own. Doctors wore beaked masks filled with herbs, believing the scent could block the air of death. They didn't know the truth, that the killer was already inside their walls. The air grew heavy with the smell of decay. Street after street lay empty, save for the sound of carts creaking under the weight of corpses. In London, in Florence, in Paris, the same story repeated. Life itself seemed to collapse. Witnesses spoke of people dropping mid-sentence, bleeding from their mouths, their bodies blackened with swollen sores. Priests refused last rites. Gravediggers vanished before their work was done. No one dared touch the dead, not even for gold. To many, it felt like the end of the world. And in a way, it was. Half of Europe would soon be gone. Entire villages erased from the map. And all that remained was a question whispered in fear. What was this invisible force that could erase millions? As the continent burned with plague, a darker truth began to emerge. This was not the first time the sickness had appeared, and it would not be the last.
Before the sickness reached Europe, it had already begun its silent march across the world. Long before the first ships docked in Sicily, something was moving along the great arteries of trade, through caravans, markets, and ports. A shadow, invisible but relentless. Historians trace its beginning to the east, to the wide steppes and bustling cities of Asia where life and death traveled side by side on the Silk Road. Merchants carried silks, spices, and gold, but hidden within their cargo, something else had joined the journey. Something small, unseen, clinging to the fur of rats that scurried among the bales of grain. In the 1340s, reports spoke of entire regions collapsing overnight. Cities in China and Central Asia fell silent. Caravans vanished in the desert, and no one understood why. The Mongol Empire, once the mighty bridge between East and West, began to fracture. Towns that had thrived for centuries were reduced to ruins and ash. But the world beyond had no idea. They thought it was war, rebellion, or famine. In truth, it was the beginning of something much darker. In 1346, the great port city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading colony on the Crimean coast, became the stage for an event that would change history forever. The city was under siege by the Mongols. For months, they hurled stones, arrows, and fire into its walls. But then something strange happened. The Mongol army began to die. Not from swords, not from wounds, but from the same black swellings that would soon terrify Europe. As their soldiers dropped by the thousands, the commanders made a decision both desperate and horrifying. They ordered the corpses of their own men to be catapulted over Kaffa's walls. Rotting, diseased bodies crashing into the streets below. The first recorded act of biological warfare in human history. Inside the city, the plague spread like wildfire, and when the surviving Genoese merchants fled by ship, they carried the sickness with them. Across the Black Sea, across the Mediterranean, to Constantinople, to Venice, to Marseille, everywhere they went, death followed. By the time Europe realized what had arrived, it was already too late. The shadow had reached the heart of civilization. Ships docked, sailors unloaded cargo, and within days, entire ports were dying. In October of 1347, a fleet of 12 Genoa ships reached the Sicilian port of Messina. Witnesses describe sailors covered in black boils, coughing blood, their flesh turning dark. The locals tried to drive the ships away, but the rats and their hidden passengers had already disembarked. From Messina, the infection spread in all directions, north to Italy, west to France, and across the English Channel. No fortress, no border, no faith could stop it. It traveled with merchants, with beggars, with wind and rain. It traveled with life itself. Soon rumors filled every tavern and church. Some said it was a curse sent by God. Others whispered it was the work of dark sorcery or poisoned wells. But the truth, the scientific truth, would remain buried for centuries. The Black Death had come, and the world that existed before it would never return.
No one could see it, no one could touch it, and yet it touched everything. The plague moved silently, through the air, through the streets, through the smallest corners of the human world. It didn't strike like war or famine. It didn't need armies or kings. It only needed time. The people of 14th century Europe searched desperately for answers. They blamed the stars, the winds, the wrath of heaven itself. But the true culprit was not divine, it was biological. Hidden beneath the fur of rats, living within the gut of tiny fleas, was a microscopic organism, a killer that science would not discover for nearly 600 years. Its name? Yersinia pestis. This bacterium had evolved in silence for millennia, waiting for a world connected enough to carry it far. When the trade routes opened between Asia and Europe, it found its moment. Each flea that bit an infected rat became a vessel of death. When the rat died, the starving flea leapt to the next warm body, often a human one. Within days of infection, the symptoms began. A fever that burned like fire, pain so deep it felt as if the bones themselves were breaking. And then, the swelling. Black, painful lumps forming under the arms, in the groin, along the neck. These were called buboes, and they marked the beginning of the end. Victims coughed blood, lost consciousness, and often died within 3 days. Those who survived the first week were rare, and even they were left scarred and weak for life. But here's what puzzled many scholars centuries later. Not all outbreaks behaved the same. Some villages were wiped out overnight. Others lingered for months. Some showed signs of a disease that spread by air, not by fleas. How could the same plague kill in so many different ways? Modern scientists have proposed theories that challenge the accepted story. Some believe there were multiple strains of plague acting at once, each evolving faster than human immunity could adapt. Others suggest it wasn't just fleas or rats at all, but something far more terrifying. Records tell of people falling ill with no rat infestations nearby, of monasteries and mountaintop villages isolated from trade, dying just as fast as cities. It hinted at something airborne, something that didn't need contact or carriers, something that could spread simply by breathing the same air. But in the 14th century, such thoughts were unthinkable. They had no concept of germs, no knowledge of infection. All they could do was watch as their world fell apart, believing they were cursed or that Judgment Day had come. Doctors wrapped themselves in waxed robes, filled their masks with herbs, and carried canes to prod at the dying, thinking they were safe. They weren't. The unseen killer did not care for reason or ritual. It crossed seas, mountains, and kingdoms with ease. And every time it moved, it adapted. By the time scholars began keeping written records, over 25 million people were already gone. Europe's greatest cities had become graveyards. And still, no one understood what they were truly fighting, because you can't fight what you cannot see. And in the 14th century, the unseen was winning. When the plague arrived, fear spread faster than the disease itself. It consumed cities, towns, and villages. It entered homes before the first body had even cooled. And it fed on the human mind as much as the body. People didn't just die, they panicked. Families abandoned loved ones. Neighbors turned on each other. Entire communities accused one another of inviting the sickness. Rumors grew like wildfire. Poisoned wells, cursed travelers, witches in disguise. Religion became both a shield and a weapon. Churches overflowed with the desperate seeking salvation. Priests sprinkled holy water over streets, chanting prayers that echoed through empty alleyways. Yet, even God seemed absent. The faithful fell one by one. Some turned to flagellants, men and women who marched through towns, whipping themselves to atone for sins they believed had angered heaven. Their blood-stained robes and screaming chants became a symbol of terror. Yet their rituals did nothing to stop the plague. In fact, their gatherings often spread it further. Other communities sought scapegoats. Jews were blamed, accused of poisoning wells. Entire neighborhoods were slaughtered in the name of fear. And still, the disease raged on, indifferent to blame or penance. Superstition ruled the day. People carried charms, wore amulets, and burned fragrant herbs, hoping to keep the unseen killer at bay. They avoided touching the sick, yet still lived in the same air that carried the plague. Every cough, every fever, every blackened limb became a reminder that death could strike anywhere, at any time. Even the most powerful rulers were helpless. Kings and queens watched their ports fall silent. Advisors disappeared overnight. Armies shrank as soldiers succumbed to the invisible enemy. The psychological toll was staggering. Mass hysteria took root, creating scenes as horrific as the disease itself. Graveyards overflowed, cart after cart transported bodies, stacked like logs. Survivors described streets filled with cries, smells, and sights that defied imagination. And yet, amid the despair, people clung to faith. Processions marched through the streets, candles flickered in windows, prayers were whispered in abandoned chapels. Even when the rituals failed, the human need for hope, for something beyond the terror, persisted. The Black Death was more than a plague. It was a mirror, reflecting the fears, the beliefs, and the fragility of humanity. It revealed that when the world falls apart, people grasped for anything to explain the unexplainable. And while faith and fear battled in the hearts of men, the killer moved on silently, methodically, leaving death in its wake. Because when the unseen strikes, no prayer, no charm, no ritual can hold it back. The plague did not only kill bodies, it shattered the very foundations of life itself. By the mid-14th century, Europe was no longer the same world that had welcomed the Genoese ships. Every city, every town, every village bore the marks of its horror. Markets emptied, merchants fled. Goods rotted on shelves untouched as buyers had vanished with the living. Farms lay fallow, fields untended, livestock abandoned. Famine followed in the plague's shadow, and death compounded upon death. Labor became scarce. Those who survived found themselves in sudden demand, but also sudden peril. Whole towns offered unimaginable wages for work, yet many fled, fearing that even the living carried the unseen killer. Craftsmen disappeared, guilds collapsed, and trade ground to a halt. The social hierarchy crumbled. Nobles could no longer command serfs who had survived. Peasants demanded new rights, new freedoms, and in many regions, they received them simply because the old order no longer had the numbers to resist. The feudal system, centuries old, began to fracture under the weight of mortality. Entire cities fell into chaos. In Florence, Venice, and Paris, cemeteries overflowed. Mass graves were dug hastily outside walls. Cart after cart carried the dead, neighbors and strangers alike, to be stacked in earth like kindling.
cholera-scented winds carried whispers of despair and fear across the rooftops. Education, culture, even religion struggled to endure. Schools closed, universities emptied, monasteries abandoned. Knowledge that had survived generations risked vanishing in the same shadow that stole life. Books, parchments, and wisdom were left to decay, unattended as their caretakers succumbed. And yet, in the midst of this chaos, strange patterns emerged. Survivors inherited more than grief. They inherited opportunity. Labor shortages gave them leverage, bargaining power once unimaginable. They began to migrate, to seek new lands, to demand better treatment. A world that had once been rigidly structured now teetered on the edge of transformation. The plague did not simply destroy life. It destroyed old orders, old certainties, and old hierarchies. Europe, bleeding and broken, was forced to reinvent itself. But for those who lived through it, there was no time for reflection. Every day was a battle against despair, disease, and death. The streets were empty, the houses silent, and the air thick with mourning. Life had become fragile, fleeting, and terrifyingly precious. And in this void, the seeds of the modern world, commerce, labor rights, science, and social change were quietly planted. The collapse was not the end. It was a turning point. Yet even as society crumbled, the Black Death continued its relentless march. It had no conscience, it had no mercy, and it had no plans to stop.
For centuries, the source of the Black Death remained a mystery. Scholars and historians pieced together fragments of evidence, trying to trace its path across continents, but the truth seemed always just out of reach. The accepted story, that fleas on rats carried the plague from Asia to Europe, explained much, but not all. Some villages, isolated from trade routes and without rats, were still decimated. Some outbreaks spread too quickly to be explained by fleas alone. Something deeper, more complex was at play. Speculation ran wild. Some believed the disease was man-made, an early form of biological warfare, perhaps unleashed during sieges like in Kaffa. Others suggested cosmic forces, unusual weather patterns, or even volcanic eruptions that altered the air and created conditions for disease to spread more aggressively. Frozen remains, studied centuries later, revealed clues that challenged conventional thinking. DNA from victims showed not just one, but multiple strains of Yersinia pestis. It seemed the pathogen evolved rapidly, mutating as it spread, adapting to new hosts and climates. Could there have been more than one wave hitting Europe simultaneously? Could it have emerged independently in different regions? Some researchers even proposed darker possibilities. Accounts from monasteries and rural communities speak of airborne sickness with no rat infestation nearby. It's as if the disease sometimes spread through the air itself, invisible, unstoppable, striking without warning. A silent predator capable of reaching the most remote corners of Europe. And yet, for all the science and speculation, some questions remain unanswered. Why did some regions survive relatively unscathed, while others were completely wiped out? Why did certain social classes or professions suffer disproportionately? Why did the plague repeatedly return over the following centuries, each time with deadly efficiency? The hidden source of the Black Death is not just a question of biology. It is a puzzle of history, environment, and human society. Trade, warfare, famine, and migration all created conditions that allowed this microscopic killer to flourish. But even these explanations cannot fully account for the fear, the devastation, and the inexplicable patterns that emerged. Europeans at the time could not know the science behind the deaths, but they felt the truth in every empty street, every shuttered home, every cart carrying the dead. The plague was not random. It followed invisible threads woven from commerce, travel, and human ambition. Yet at the same time, it was utterly chaotic, striking where logic and reason failed to predict. The hidden source is not only a question of origin, it is a mirror of human ignorance. It reminds us that for all our knowledge, for all our preparation, there are forces in this world that remain beyond our control. And as Europe struggled to survive, the plague shadows stretched far beyond the immediate deaths. It began to reshape the very fabric of human existence, from society to science, from superstition to survival. When the plague finally receded, Europe was a different world. Cities that had once thrived were reduced to husks of stone and timber. Fields lay barren, markets silent, and entire communities vanished from the map. Yet, amid the devastation, life struggled to return. Survivors emerged into a landscape of death and despair. Those who had lived through the worst carried with them scars, both visible and invisible. Skin marked by sores, lungs weakened, bodies weakened by fevers, and minds haunted by the sights they had witnessed. Carts overflowing with the dead, churches echoing with tolling bells, neighbors disappearing one by one. But the survivors also inherited something else: opportunity. Labor was scarce, and those who remained found their work suddenly in demand. Peasants could demand better wages, artisans were sought after, and merchants filled gaps left by the fallen. The rigid social hierarchies of medieval Europe began to shift. Power, once concentrated in the hands of the few, spread across the living. In villages and cities alike, people migrated, seeking lands untouched by the disease. Some rebuilt communities from scratch, others abandoned their homes entirely, leaving fields and villages to nature. Europe's population, once decimated, began a slow recovery, reshaping towns, economies, and trade routes along the way. The plague also left its mark on human biology. Modern studies of genetics suggest that survivors may have carried immunity that altered the course of human evolution. Some descendants had a resistance to the same strain, and this silent inheritance would echo through generations. Culture and religion shifted as well. Art and literature began to reflect death more openly, grappling with mortality in ways previously unimaginable. Churches adapted, communities formed new rituals, and scholars began questioning the world around them, seeking understanding in the face of catastrophe. Yet, for every story of resilience, there were stories of despair. Entire families wiped out, trades lost forever, and towns that never recovered. The psychological toll lingered for decades, shaping societies in ways that would resonate far beyond the 14th century. The Black Death was not simply a plague of bodies, it was a transformation of civilization. It altered economies, reshaped communities, and forced humanity to confront its own fragility. The world had survived, but it would never again be the same. And as survivors looked to rebuild, they carried with them a new understanding, a knowledge born not of science, but of experience. The Black Death had taught the living lessons in resilience, adaptation, and the fragility of life. But even as they began to heal, questions remained. Could such a calamity ever strike again? Had humanity truly learned its lesson, or was it only a matter of time before the shadow returned?
The Black Death did not end with the last body burned or the final bell toll. Its shadow stretched far beyond the 14th century, reaching into every corner of European life. The plague reshaped not only the physical world, but the very way humans thought, lived, and governed. Economically, Europe transformed. Labor shortages forced higher wages, improved working conditions, and the weakening of feudal bonds. Peasants gained leverage, towns gained autonomy, and trade slowly resumed with new vigor. The seeds of modern commerce, entrepreneurship, and labor rights were sown in the ashes of catastrophe. Socially, the plague forced communities to confront mortality like never before. Art, literature, and religion reflected this new awareness. Paintings depicted death as an unavoidable companion. Literature wrestled with fear, grief, and the fragility of life. Religious movements emerged, some seeking comfort, others seeking to explain a world that had seemed abandoned. Science and medicine also began to change. Though germ theory lay centuries ahead, the Black Death inspired curiosity and experimentation. Doctors recorded symptoms, cities experimented with quarantine, and scholars began questioning long-held beliefs about the natural world. The idea that human knowledge could confront such a calamity, even imperfectly, began to take root. The psychological legacy was profound. Generations of survivors carried trauma that would echo for decades. Families remembered the horror. Towns remembered the silence. Entire cultures internalized the fragility of existence. And yet, life endured. Empires rebuilt, trade flourished, and knowledge slowly advanced. The Black Death had killed millions, but it also inadvertently created conditions for growth, innovation, and progress. Without the catastrophe, some historians argue, Europe may not have emerged into the Renaissance as it did. But the legacy of death was not only practical, it was moral, spiritual, and existential. It forced humanity to confront questions that had no easy answers. Why do we suffer? Why does death strike without reason? How do we rebuild when the world we knew is gone? The Black Death taught lessons in survival and resilience. It revealed the power of disease to reshape societies and the fragility of human control over nature. And it left behind a warning, one that echoes even today. No matter how advanced civilization becomes, life remains vulnerable, and history can repeat itself in ways both terrifying and unexpected. The shadow of the Black Death lingers not just in history books, but in the very structure of modern life. It changed everything from economy to culture, from science to society. And it did so through a single, unrelenting truth. Death leaves a mark that outlives the dead.
Even centuries later, the Black Death refuses to release its secrets. We can measure it, study it, and reconstruct its path, but there are pieces that remain out of reach, patterns that defy logic, outbreaks that strike in unexpected places, and stories that make historians question the accepted narrative. The plague was not just a disease, it was a force that exposed human fragility, social weakness, and the limits of knowledge. It revealed how fear and superstition could shape societies, how desperation could breed both cruelty and innovation, and how death could act as a catalyst for transformation. DNA studies of victims buried in mass graves show traces of multiple strains, a reminder that nature adapts, evolves, and strikes in ways we cannot always predict. Some outbreaks suggest airborne transmission, others flea-borne, and in some remote regions, both theories fail to explain the devastation. The truth is layered, complex, and hauntingly elusive. The Black Death reshaped Europe irrevocably. It altered economies, empowered survivors, and paved the way for social and scientific revolutions. It transformed art, literature, and culture, embedding the memory of death into the very consciousness of society. And yet, even as we understand more today, questions remain. Could such a catastrophe happen again? Could new pathogens emerge unnoticed until it's too late? The lessons of the 14th century are stark. Humanity can survive, but survival comes at a cost. The cost of loss, of fear, of adaptation, and of memory. The dark truth is this: the Black Death was never just a story of the past. It is a warning, a reflection, a reminder that life is fragile and that history can repeat itself in ways both visible and unseen. We can honor the dead, study the evidence, and rebuild what was lost, but the shadow of the plague remains, a silent teacher, whispering through centuries, echoing in the empty streets, and warning every generation that no matter how advanced we become, some forces remain beyond our control. Because death, like the Black Death, is patient, invisible, and inevitable. And that is the dark truth behind the deadliest pandemic in history. If you enjoyed this video and are still not subscribed, please consider it, as it really helps me out a lot. Thank you.